Specifically, what direct action can the population take? What are the most important direct actions that the population can take against this collusion, against this complex?
Yeah. Well, with regard to voting, I don't think there's a general principle. I mean, you just make your decisions. I don't think it's usually not a major decision, like it's not going to have a big effect on things. It may have some effect on things. So you just decide, like, is it important enough to have an effect in this and that case? And there's no general principle. But on the other question, what can be done? Well, everything can be done. Everything can be done up to the point of eliminating all structures of authority and repression. They're human institutions. They can be dismantled. If you ask yourself what's the most important, well, that's not the kind of thing you decide in a meeting like this. I mean, those are the kinds of decisions that come by serious thought among people who are really trying to institute change. Now, typically, given the world the way it is, you start with where the world is, okay? Like, you don't start by saying, okay, let's overthrow transnational corporations, okay? I think that's because it's just not within range, So you start with saying, look, here's where the world is. What can we begin to do? Well, you can begin to do things which will get people to understand better what the source of real power is and just how much they can achieve. Like, you can start by, first of all, you can start by getting us to stop torturing people, right? Like, there's easy things to do, or stop killing children in Cuba, let's say. Stop, massacring in East Timor. Those are easy things. So let's do those. First do the easy things. With regard to the domestic scene, take, say, the crime bills. I mean, they're just, like I said, they're the domestic equivalent of death squads. The fact that they're targeting vulnerable populations who are being turned into people under military occupation, look, that's an easy one to change. I mean, you really just have to change opinion on that one. You aren't striking at the core of private power when you begin to have a civilized criminal system instead of a brutal, barbaric one. So that one, I think, is changeable. What about the war against children and families, another case that I mentioned? Well, that's another easy one. I mean, the the European-Japanese model, incidentally, it's not, I don't want to suggest it's so beautiful, except in comparison to ours, but those are countries very much like us. They have the same institutions, the same economy, and so on and so forth. They have simply not been subjected to unilateral business power as much as here for all kind of historical reasons. And we can certainly become like those countries. There's, in fact, a model sitting right in front of you, countries very much like us. Take, say, health care. Well, the U.S. is off the spectrum on that one, too. Again, I think for the same reasons. I mean, even if you just look a couple of miles to the north, there's a country very much like us, which happens to have instituted a semi-civilized, again, plenty of things wrong with it, but a semi-civilized system of health care not that far back in the 1960s, under conditions that we could easily duplicate. Well, those are things that I don't want to say those things are going to be easy, but they're within range. On things like GATT, you're getting into harder territory, because here crucial interests of authoritarian institutions are at stake. And then you're going to begin to face the fact, which after all is a fact that sooner or later you have to face, that maybe the most totalitarian institution in human history, or certainly close to it, is a corporation. It's an institution in which authority goes strictly from top to bottom. Ultimately it's in the hands of owners and investors. If you're inside the system, you take orders from above and transmit them down. If you're outside the system, there are very weak popular controls, which indeed are eroding. I should say that this is not an insight of mine. It was pointed out by Thomas Jefferson in his later years when he warned, these are just the early days of corporations, he warned that if power was going to shift into the hands of what he called banking institutions and moneyed-in corporations, then the democratic experiment would be over. we'd be back to a form of absolutism worse than what they struggled against. Thomas Jefferson is not exactly a figure who's off the spectrum in American history. So this is not a new insight. It's as American as apple pie. We should recognize what Thomas Jefferson could see, in fact, Adam Smith. But when you see that, you realize that it's a hard nut to crack, because there are enormous agglomerations of power, indeed concentrating and indeed transnational, which are protected from scrutiny or from popular action, and that's got to change. After all, why do corporations have the rights they do? Why are they treated as immortal persons? Contrary to the warnings of people like Adam Smith and others, it was not by law. This was by decisions made in courts and by judges and by lawyers, which simply changed the climate totally. And that can be reversed too. Institutions can be under popular control, including the economic institutions. Well, organizing to try to achieve that is a much more long-term operation, but it's got to begin somewhere, So if you ask what should be done, well, I don't think any sane human being can look around at the world around them and not figure out things that have to be done. Take a walk through Baltimore, You'll find plenty of things that have to be done. So, you get started doing them. Some of them are broader in scale, so, you think about those. But you're not going to do them alone. Like if you take a walk down the streets of Baltimore and you say, oh yeah, that ought to be done, nothing's going to happen. On the other hand, if people are organized enough to act about it, yeah, they can achieve things, and there's no particular limit to what they can achieve. That's why we don't live under slavery or under feudalism and so on.
You mentioned specific organizations that are involved in breaking apart this collusion. I know you can't mention specific actions, but can you mention organizations that are involved in working on this problem specifically?
Which problems?
The problem of collusion between corporations and government.
Well, a lot of organizations are involved from different points of view. For example, at one level, which is important, though of course superficial, Nader's Public Citizen is involved. But that's important, as I say, but kind of not really touching the structure of power. Beyond that, if the American labor movement ever recovers the insights that ordinary working people, and in fact the labor movement had 100 years ago, it'll be working against them. You go back 100 years, and in fact up until much more recently than that, and the major thrust of the labor movement was what was sometimes, industrial democracy, placing the workplace under democratic control. That wasn't, they didn't read that in Marx. Everybody figured that out for themselves long before Marx. And that's and he in fact didn't say anything much about it. This is, so it could be the labor movement, let's say. And in fact, just about there's tons of activism going on, usually focused on pretty narrow issues, but they're all talking about illegitimate authority of one form or another. And their interests are common, and they have to be built up and extended. I have my own views as to, if you want a list, it's easy to find.
Yes.
It's easy to find lots of lists. So if you write to any of the major funding organizations, like say Resist in Boston, they'll be delighted to give you a list of the couple hundred groups they funded in the last couple of years. And you will find among them groups involved in anything you can imagine. Or if you go to I'm sure there's some church-based group in either Baltimore or Washington, I don't know the scene well enough, which is a center for, a coordinating center for all kinds of peace and justice activities. And you'll find anything in the world there, just about. That happens everywhere.